They say a man's humanity can be measured by how he treats those who can't fight back. At Rikers Island, that humanity is tested 3 times a day: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Inside these walls, food isn't just nutrition, it's power. It's control. It's punishment. Before we go further into this dark reality, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's evidence. In 2022, a Federal Monitor report exposed what thousands of inmates at Rikers Island had been whispering for years: that food wasn't just bad. It was weaponized. Inside New York City's most notorious jail complex, meals became a way to discipline, to humiliate, and to remind the incarcerated that even the smallest part of their lives belonged to someone else. It started with cold trays. An inmate could argue with an officer, and suddenly their food would arrive half-frozen, the meat congealed, the bread soaked through with condensation. Others would get undercooked rice, sometimes even raw chicken, a silent punishment with the message, "You talk too much." Those assigned to the kitchen, usually inmates serving disciplinary infractions, told investigators that guards sometimes gave them orders to teach a lesson. One described being told to serve smaller portions to specific inmates after fights or verbal confrontations. And in the segregation units, where prisoners are already locked down for 23 hours a day, that practice went even further. Inmates said their trays were light, almost half the portion they saw served elsewhere. Rikers administration didn't deny it completely. In fact, internal reports showed meal variation due to security concerns, listed as an acceptable practice. The phrase was bureaucratic camouflage, a way to turn psychological punishment into policy. Meanwhile, the kitchens themselves were a disaster zone. The Department of Investigation had already found evidence of rodents, broken freezers, and leaking ceilings. In some areas, food was being stored next to cleaning chemicals. Employees had to dodge puddles of rancid water dripping from vents. Even correctional officers, speaking anonymously, admitted that no one wanted to eat the food they served. One officer said, "We don't eat what they eat. Not a chance. I've seen trays crawling with roaches." Still, every day thousands of meals left those filthy kitchens. Beans, rice, mystery meat, all prepared by inmates earning pennies an hour. And each tray, sliding through the slot of a cell door, carried more than calories. It carried power. Food in prison was supposed to represent order. But at Rikers, it became a currency of control. For those in solitary confinement, mealtime was one of the few moments of human contact. But even that was corrupted. Some officers delayed meals for hours, others tossed trays on the floor just out of reach. And the inmates knew that complaining could make tomorrow's meal worse. The Federal Monitor's 2022 report described this culture as systemic degradation. It wasn't just about the food being bad, it was about what bad food meant. It meant submission. It meant silence. It meant survival. Because when a man is hungry enough, even spoiled food becomes a form of obedience. And Rikers wasn't the only place this happened. Across the U.S., from Cook County Jail to Orleans Parish, prison kitchens had become stages where neglect met cruelty, and where punishment wore an apron instead of a badge. The difference was that Rikers' truth came out, in paperwork, testimony, and the unending stench of what officials called compliance issues. In 2022, when city officials were questioned about the report, they admitted that the kitchens were decades out of compliance with health codes. They promised repairs. They promised modernization. But for those still locked inside, nothing changed. Cold food still arrived cold. Spoiled meat still arrived spoiled. And even as advocates demanded reform, one thing remained clear. At Rikers Island, punishment wasn't confined to the cell. It was served on a tray. If Rikers Island is the boiling point, then America's entire correctional system is the stove. The problem of food as punishment isn't isolated to New York. It stretches from the Louisiana swamps of Angola prison, to the snow-covered mountains of Colorado's ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Each facility with its own rules and codes hides the same unspoken truth. Inside these kitchens, food has become a tool of domination. In the early 2000s, federal inspectors began noticing a disturbing pattern. Reports from prisons in Illinois, California, and Pennsylvania echoed the same words used at Rikers: cold, spoiled, inedible. But behind those words lay something deeper: intent. The most infamous example came in the form of something bland, beige, and perfectly designed for cruelty: the Nutraloaf. The birth of Nutraloaf. Originally marketed as a disciplinary meal, Nutraloaf was introduced as a way to ensure prisoners received nutrition without the privilege of normal food. In reality, it was punishment disguised as nourishment, a brick-shaped loaf made from whatever was available. Oatmeal, pureed vegetables, beans, powdered milk, and sometimes leftovers from previous meals all blended together and baked into one tasteless lump. In Vermont, Illinois, and New York, lawsuits were filed by inmates claiming the loaf violated their Eighth Amendment rights, protection against cruel and unusual punishment. Some described the smell as unbearable, others said it made them vomit. But prison officials defended it as safe, efficient, and nutritionally complete. They were right about one thing: it was efficient. It removed the need for utensils, trays, or preparation. It also removed dignity. Across the U.S., judges were split. Some called the loaf unpalatable but lawful. Others banned it outright. But even when it disappeared from the official menu, its philosophy remained: that food could be used not to sustain but to break. ADX Florence, the quiet cruelty of perfection. In the Supermax prison of ADX Florence, inmates don't get the filth of Rikers or the chaos of Angola. Instead, they get precision, meals delivered through narrow slots portioned by machine designed for control. Everything is sterile, stainless steel, and silent. Yet even here, the punishment is hidden in plain sight. Former inmates, including Thomas Silverstein, who spent decades in isolation, described the meals as robot food, perfectly portioned but deliberately bland, meant to erase pleasure and time. Each tray was identical, every bite predictable, stripping away not just flavor but a sense of life's rhythm. Silverstein once wrote, "You stop looking forward to food. You stop looking forward to anything." In a place where silence is total and light never dims, the only reminder of the outside world is the food that arrives, lifeless, repetitive, and cold. Angola Prison, the Plantation Menu. In the Deep South, Louisiana State Penitentiary, better known as Angola, offers another side of this story, one rooted in America's past. Built on a former slave plantation, Angola's kitchens are still run largely by inmate labor, often black men working under white supervisors. Reports from the Louisiana Department of Health and Civil Rights groups show that spoiled meat, moldy bread, and rotten vegetables were regularly served. Inmates described meat that smelled like death, and grits with bugs. But Angola's cruelty isn't just in what's served, it's in how it's earned. The men who work in the fields, often unpaid, harvest vegetables that end up in the meals they're forced to eat. Those who refuse to work risk losing food privileges, medical care, or visitation rights. It's a system that blurs the line between punishment and slavery, echoing the 13th Amendment loophole, except as a punishment for crime. Food here isn't a right. It's leverage. When hunger becomes policy. By the 2010s, advocacy groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Prison Policy Initiative began connecting the dots. Bad food wasn't the result of chaos or incompetence, it was a form of policy. In overcrowded, underfunded systems, cutting food quality saves money and enforces obedience. In Mississippi, inmates reported being served food infested with maggots. In Michigan, the state's private contractor Aramark was fined millions for serving spoiled meat and allowing employees to smuggle contraband in food carts. Yet contracts continued. In 2022, as Rikers made headlines again, Aramark and other private contractors quietly renewed deals across multiple states. Because in a system designed around control, bad food works. Starve a man and you control his mind. Feed him filth and you control his will. Food is supposed to be universal, a human need that connects all people, free or not. But in America's toughest jails, it's become something else. A reminder that punishment doesn't stop at the bars, it's baked, boiled, and boxed into every single meal. By now, the story isn't just about cruelty, it's about commerce. Behind every cold tray and spoiled meal is a contract, a spreadsheet, and a profit margin that decides what a human being eats behind bars. In the last 2 decades, feeding prisoners in America has become a multi-billion-dollar industry dominated by just a handful of companies: Aramark, Trinity Services Group, and Keefe Group. Their contracts span hundreds of facilities and millions of meals per week, all calculated down to the penny. And when your goal is to save pennies, quality dies first. The price of a life, 63 cents a meal. In 2022, an investigative report revealed that several state prison systems had reduced food budgets to as low as 63 cents per inmate per meal. That number sounds impossible until you realize how it works. The companies cut costs by buying expired food, using filler ingredients, or reserving leftovers. The cheaper the meal, the higher the profit. In Michigan, Aramark's contract, worth over $145 million, was supposed to modernize prison food service. Instead, within 2 years, the state fined the company multiple times for serving rotten meat, running out of food and smuggling contraband. One inspector described trays containing moldy bread, cold beans, and something that might once have been chicken. But the state didn't cancel the deal immediately. Why? Because privatization saves money on paper, even when it costs humanity in practice. The whistleblowers. Inside the industry, a few brave voices tried to speak out. A former Aramark employee, Teresa Lewis, told investigators that managers pressured her to reuse food scraps, scrape leftovers back into trays, and water down sauces to stretch supplies. She described one day when guards refused to deliver meals because the smell of spoiled meat was too strong. In Florida, another worker reported that Trinity Services Group forced kitchen staff to prepare mystery meat stew with unidentifiable frozen blocks labeled only as protein base. When she complained, she was transferred, not promoted, not protected, transferred out. Even more alarming are the cases where whistleblowers were punished while companies kept their contracts. The system protected profit, not people. Contracts of control. To understand how this works, you have to look at the fine print. Private prison food contracts are written with incentive clauses, bonuses for keeping costs low, not for keeping food safe. If an inspector finds violations, the company pays a small fine. If it saves a few cents per meal, it keeps millions in profit. At Rikers Island, city records showed that in 2022, the Department of Corrections spent less than $3 per day per inmate on food, less than what a cup of coffee costs outside. Meanwhile, city audits found that hundreds of thousands of dollars in food deliveries disappeared before reaching the kitchens. Boxes marked for inmates were rerouted to staff cafeterias or discarded due to spoilage. It's theft, but it's legal theft, because the people being stolen from have no power to complain. The economics of suffering. When you strip food of taste, texture, and respect, what's left is obedience. That's the unspoken purpose. A hungry man doesn't protest. A weak man doesn't fight back. Food becomes part of the disciplinary chain, cheaper to degrade than to reform. And because inmates have no choice, the companies that feed them have no competition. Inmates can't shop around. They can't write a bad review. Their silence is built into the business model. The profits are staggering. Aramark alone reports billions in annual revenue, with prison food service being one of its most consistent divisions. Every time a new prison is built or an old one overcrowds, their stock rises. And this isn't just about food. It's about control economies. The same companies often supply phone services, commissaries, and even uniforms. Each system feeds into the next. Deny quality in one, sell relief in another. Bad food means more commissary sales. That's profit. The human toll. Inmates describe symptoms that sound like scenes from a famine zone. Chronic stomach pain from spoiled food. Rapid weight loss during lockdowns. Food poisoning treated with aspirin. In 2021, at the Parchman Farm Prison in Mississippi, several inmates died from infections reportedly linked to unsanitary kitchens. At Rikers, federal monitors found similar health outbreaks linked to food handling. Yet the cycle continued because lawsuits are slow, and hunger is immediate. Every spoonful becomes a reminder that their lives are managed, measured, and monetized. The silence at the top. When asked why they keep renewing contracts with these companies, state officials use the same phrase, budget efficiency. But in reality, cutting corners costs lives. The public rarely sees it because prison walls hide more than people. They hide evidence. Journalists, inspectors, even family members are kept out of the kitchens. The public's image of prison food, a tray of rice and beans, is far less grotesque than the truth. Expired cans, pest infestations, and meat unfit for human consumption. And while those behind bars are dehumanized, those behind the contracts get promotions, bonuses, and government awards for cost optimization. A nation fed by neglect. From Rikers to ADX Florence, from Angola to San Quentin, America's prison food system tells one story over and over. You can't reform cruelty when cruelty is profitable. Because in a nation where meals are monetized, hunger is not an accident. It's policy. You can read hundreds of government reports about prison food, and still never understand it, until you hear it from the men and women who live it. Across America's prison system, letters and sworn testimonies tell a story too raw to sanitize. They come from segregation cells, from isolation wings, from dormitories where food arrives in plastic bags instead of trays. And they describe one thing above all, the slow starvation of dignity. It smells like rot. Rikers Island, New York City. In 2022, a man named Ramon, incarcerated at Rikers Island, wrote to his sister about his meals. His words, later used in a class action complaint, were chilling. The chicken was still pink, but they said if we don't eat again until morning. The bread smelled like mold. I threw up twice and the officer laughed. Ramon wasn't alone. Dozens of similar accounts flooded federal monitors. Some inmates said they were forced to eat through hunger strikes, others that meal refusals were punished by removing commissary privileges. One particularly disturbing statement described officers stomping on food trays before sliding them into cells during lockdown. The practice was reported as an isolated incident. But every man in that block told the same story. You can hear the rats. Angola Prison, Louisiana. Letters from Louisiana's Angola Prison, nicknamed The Farm, read like something from another century. At night you can hear the rats before you see them, wrote Daryl, a man serving a life sentence. They live under the kitchen floor. Sometimes they fall into the rice bins. We told them. They said, protein is protein. Angola's food system relies on inmate labor. The men who cook, clean, and serve are prisoners themselves, supervised by a handful of correctional staff. In theory, it's rehabilitation. In practice, it's coerced servitude. Daryl said he worked 10-hour shifts peeling potatoes, unpaid. If you complain, they reassign you to the fields. And out there, you don't get shade or water. A 2015 inspection by the Louisiana Department of Health found violations in every kitchen unit, including rodent infestation and food stored next to raw sewage pipes. The report was filed and forgotten. It's like eating punishment. ADX Florence, Colorado. At ADX Florence, the nation's highest security prison, food isn't filthy. It's sterile. Perfectly portioned. Calorie counted. A kind of scientific punishment. Former inmate Jack Powers described it this way. It's not the dirt or the bugs that get you here, it's the nothingness. The food tastes like paper. You eat it because you have to, not because it means anything. It's part of the silence. Every meal arrives through a steel slot. No human hands. No words exchanged. 4 years, psychologists studying ADX have linked its food delivery system to sensory deprivation, noting how monotonous meals amplify mental decay. When you take away flavor, one former staff psychologist explained, you take away joy. When you take away joy, you take away will. That's not hyperbole. That's policy. The tray is a weapon. Cook County Jail, Illinois. In 2019, after a riot in Cook County Jail, inmates said guards withheld meals from entire units as punishment. One man's affidavit reads, "We were locked down for 2 days. No food. They said we were animals. Then they brought cold bologna sandwiches that smelled like bleach." When asked for comment, the Cook County Sheriff's Office denied intentional deprivation but admitted to delays in food service due to security measures. That phrase, security measures, appears in dozens of reports across multiple states. It's the bureaucratic term for starvation. You don't forget hunger, letters from solitary. Perhaps the most haunting voices come from solitary confinement units. Inmates describe the slow erasure of appetite until hunger becomes identity. A letter from a man in California's Pelican Bay SHU, Security Housing Unit, reads, "When you're hungry long enough, food becomes a dream. You start thinking about flavors that don't exist anymore. You eat the smell before the meal comes. You count the minutes by your stomach." For those in the SHU, meals are often served through slots or plastic bags. Sometimes guards delay delivery. Other times they mark trays with chalk, troublemaker, snitch, refused order, as a signal for reduced portions. One inmate described seeing his tray deliberately dropped on the floor before being handed to him. When he protested, his next 3 meals came late. "They can kill you slowly without touching you," he wrote. A nation of silenced appetites. These letters are smuggled out, passed through lawyers, journalists, family members. They rarely make the news. But together they reveal something terrifying. Across America, hunger has become a language of control. Every empty stomach is a form of censorship. Every spoiled tray is a message. When food becomes punishment, rehabilitation dies. And when a system normalizes cruelty at the dinner table, what does it say about the rest of the justice system built around it? What happens when food, the most basic human need, is turned into a weapon? Science has an answer. And it's darker than anyone inside those walls could have imagined. When psychologists, neuroscientists, and human rights investigators began studying long-term food deprivation in prisons, they discovered that it doesn't just weaken the body, it reshapes the mind. Hunger, humiliation, and uncertainty trigger chemical changes that make obedience easier and rebellion harder. It is, in effect, a system designed to manufacture submission. The psychology of deprivation. In the 1950s, experiments like the Minnesota Starvation study found that even healthy men on controlled food restriction began showing severe psychological symptoms within weeks: depression, anxiety, emotional numbness, and obsessive thoughts about food. They became passive, withdrawn, docile. Now imagine those same conditions inside a prison, layered with fear, humiliation, and isolation. Prison psychologists have long warned that food punishment creates learned helplessness. When inmates never know what their next meal will taste like, or if they'll get one at all, the uncertainty itself becomes punishment. The human brain associates food with safety. Remove that link and you create chronic fear. Dr. Craig Haney, a leading researcher on the effects of solitary confinement, once said, "When you control a man's food, you don't just control his body. You colonize his mind." Inside places like Rikers, Angola, and ADX Florence, that control is perfected through routine. Every tray, every delay, every denial trains prisoners to stop expecting fairness. Over time, many stop expecting anything at all. The neurology of hunger. Hunger isn't just a feeling, it's a neurological event. When the stomach is empty, the hormone ghrelin floods the brain, sharpening anxiety and reducing impulse control. Chronic deprivation keeps ghrelin levels high, while suppressing serotonin and dopamine, chemicals responsible for balance and pleasure. The result? A mind trapped in survival mode. Decision-making collapses. Memory weakens. Emotional regulation disappears. Inmates under food deprivation become easier to manage, not because they've been rehabilitated but because their brains are in a constant state of stress fatigue. Studies by the American Psychological Association and Yale School of Medicine confirmed that sustained food insecurity triggers the same neural pathways as PTSD. The body believes it's under attack. The mind starts to obey whatever might end the pain. The humiliation factor. Food punishment doesn't always come as starvation. Sometimes it's humiliation disguised as meals. In Rikers, officers reportedly threw trays on the floor or slid them through slots covered in dust and hair. At Angola, inmates said food was dumped directly onto dirty tables to save time. This is called degradation feeding, a tactic meant to remind inmates that they are less than human. Psychologists call this symbolic degradation, and it has measurable effects. Inmates exposed to repeated food humiliation show higher rates of anxiety and insomnia, increased aggression toward other inmates, lower willingness to engage in rehabilitation programs. In short, humiliate a man's stomach, and you humiliate his soul. From obedience to collapse. When food becomes uncertain, the brain reorganizes its priorities. Survival overrides justice. Calories become currency. This leads to a dangerous spiral. Inmates start stealing, bartering, or fighting for scraps. It creates tension between prisoners, tension that keeps guards in control. Divide the hungry and they'll never unite. Correctional officers understand this dynamic, even if subconsciously. Hunger maintains order more efficiently than force. A former Rikers guard anonymously admitted in a 2022 interview, "You don't need to beat them if you can starve them. They'll fall in line on their own." It's a chilling confession, one that turns psychology into strategy. The biological toll. Long-term nutritional neglect leads to catastrophic health outcomes. Vitamin deficiency causes neurological damage and skin disease. Low protein intake weakens immunity, increasing infection rates. Spoiled or undercooked food causes gastrointestinal infections that spread rapidly in confined spaces. At Rikers, multiple inmates were hospitalized for salmonella and E. coli infections linked to unsanitary kitchens. At Mississippi's Parchman Prison, a 2020 inspection found maggots in rice containers, days before an outbreak of severe food poisoning. Yet official reports often list these as isolated incidents. They're not isolated, they're systemic. The psychological fallout after release. The damage doesn't end when the sentence does. Former inmates often develop food-related trauma, hoarding behavior, binge eating, or panic when meals are delayed. One study in 2018 found that 60% of formerly incarcerated individuals reported persistent fear of hunger, even years after release. That fear shapes reintegration. It sabotages rehabilitation. It builds invisible walls long after the physical ones are gone. Food, something the world sees as ordinary, becomes a lifelong reminder of powerlessness. When control replaces correction. The science is clear: hunger doesn't rehabilitate. It conditions. And a system built on control cannot claim to deliver justice. Prisoners aren't supposed to be tortured, yet when food is used to dominate rather than sustain, that's exactly what it becomes. The harm may be invisible, but its fingerprints are everywhere, in the trembling hands, hollow eyes, and broken trust of those who've survived America's prison kitchens. For decades, the reality of America's prison kitchens was hidden behind concrete walls and bureaucratic silence. But in the last few years, whistleblowers, lawsuits, and leaked footage have shattered that secrecy, exposing an industry that profits from human suffering and punishment disguised as meals. The footage that changed everything. In 2021, a correctional officer at Rikers Island leaked a short clip to an investigative journalist. The video showed inmates working in a dimly lit kitchen, rats crawling under shelves, raw chicken stacked beside trash bins, and trays filled with watery beans left uncovered. Within hours of its release, the footage went viral. New York City officials called it misleading, but federal monitors confirmed that the video matched what they'd seen during inspections. That clip wasn't just evidence, it was a confession broadcast to millions. The next morning, inmates in 2 housing units reportedly refused breakfast in silent protest. It was the first time Rikers' kitchen had sparked an act of collective resistance in years. The lawsuits begin. By 2022, multiple lawsuits were filed across the country. At Rikers Island, a class-action suit accused the city of violating the 8th Amendment, citing deliberate indifference to food safety. In Michigan, former inmates sued Aramark for serving contaminated food and punishing complaints. And in Louisiana, civil rights attorneys took on Angola prison, alleging that its meal practices amounted to slave-like conditions. Each case revealed the same systemic rot. Meals withheld after confrontations. Rotten food served knowingly. Whistleblowers silenced or reassigned. The courts forced a reckoning. Some prisons promised reform, new contractors, new policies, but the deeper machinery of profit and punishment remained untouched. Journalists and reformers. Groups like the Marshall Project, The Intercept, and the New York Times began publishing detailed investigations into prison food services. One journalist described the experience of visiting a state facility kitchen as walking through a crime scene no one will ever prosecute. Reformers demanded transparency, live-stream cameras in kitchens, inmate oversight boards, and external audits. Some states adopted partial measures. Others, fearing exposure, doubled down on secrecy. And yet, through every legal battle, every public denial, one truth echoed louder. You can't hide hunger forever. The turning point. By 2024, new federal oversight rules began requiring periodic inspections of correctional food systems. But real change, advocates said, must come from acknowledging that food is not a privilege, it's a right. Because a justice system that feeds people punishment instead of nourishment is not justice at all. It's vengeance with a recipe. If this story opened your eyes, don't let it end here. Share this video so the world sees what happens behind those kitchen walls. And subscribe for more real, unfiltered documentaries that reveal what others try to hide. Because truth, like hunger, can't stay silent forever.